get started. It's 11:05 on the dot. Again, thank you so much for joining us. If you don't know me, my name is Mars Maxwell. I am the the coordinator for the community investment team, and I get the opportunity to champion the community learning series. Today, we have inclusive leaders, and to the left of my screen is Gilary Massa. Gilary is this amazing and brilliant strategist, lead educator, but I'm gonna go through the bio because you've got to get this great background on this person. So Gilary Massa is a proud Afro-Latina Muslim who is spending the year living in Panama City, Panama, with her husband and 3 young children. She has a long-standing history in community engagement, public education, and activism related to equity, human rights, and social justice, and is the lead consultant for inclusive leaders. With roots in both the labor movement and student movement, Gilary has spent the last 15 years supporting school boards, advocacy organizations, post-secondary institutions, labor unions, government agencies, and private enterprises through organizational change that centers on human rights, equity, and inclusion. Gilary is driven by her own experiences as a Black immigrant Muslim woman, and her practice is rooted first and foremost in community. She has a deep commitment to creating institutional and government policies and programming that is informed by the people that are impacted the most. Gilary holds a master's in leadership and community engagement, and her research project entitled Beyond Diversity Training, Roadmap for Human Rights and Equity Organizational Change Work is amazing. Diana Grimaldos will be joining us later, and I'll definitely share her bio with you at that point. In the meantime, between time, I would love to give a land acknowledgement because after we have introduced ourselves, it's quite important that we respect and acknowledge the land that we are on. So today, let us acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and many diverse First Nations, Inuits, and Métis peoples. Turtle Island has become a home shared with settlers and the descendants of people who cannot lay claim to the term settler. Together, we honor the original peoples of Turtle Island. All of us would like to thank the original caretakers of the ground, water, and air for our use of this space today. Thank you to the Sky Woman, the Turtle, and the Muskrat. Now, I want to go ahead and jump right in. Gilary, I'm going to turn this over to you. We are so excited for Think Different, Equity and Program Design. Take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. Diana is running late for an appointment, but as Mars shared, will be joining us as we go along, but in the interest of time, we're just going to go ahead. Thank you so much for the land acknowledgement, Mars. I think for me, for us, it's really important to ground our work in a conversation about what structures exist that are excluding communities, in particular, really important to center our thinking around the challenges and the atrocities faced by Indigenous communities wherever we're based. I am currently in Panama City, Panama, as was mentioned in my introduction. It's where I was born. It's where my parents are from. And in preparation for this presentation and some others that I've done while I'm here, I've been searching for a land acknowledgement because, you know, we're used to land acknowledgements in Toronto, and I couldn't find one. And which I think is interesting in kind of the conversation around indigeneity and how we might perform our solidarity for Indigenous communities. I know what I know about Panama is that we have 8, I believe, what we call comarcas, which are semi-autonomous regions of Indigenous communities. My family is connected to the Embera tribe, which resides between what we now know as Colombia and Panama in an area called the Darien Strip or the Darien Province. But as many Indigenous people displaced and urbanized and therefore have lost kind of any roots to indigeneity. So that's what I'm sitting with the land acknowledgement from here, that in Canada, I think about settlerhood, immigration, refugee status in relationship to Indigenous communities and what the implications of that are. Here, I'm thinking about my own indigeneity and how I've lost connection to that also as a result of colonization. Okay, so we're gonna start just some housekeeping. Feel free to use the chat to share and talk amongst each other or ask a question. I'm going to be monitoring the chat, so if you do have a question, please just share it there. If you'd like to speak it out loud, that would be great as well. I really love to see faces while I present. I know that's not something that's accessible to everybody, but if you are able to turn on your cameras, that would be fantastic, because it just helps me connect with folks a little bit better. If we have time, we will have some breakout groups just to engage in the conversation on a deeper level. And if you'd like to say something, just use the raise hand feature that is on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and the reactions button. You can just raise your hand and I will just call you out as the names come up. I will be paying attention to things like gender parity, racial parity, and first-time speakers, just to make sure that we have a good diversity of thinking around the table. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. So today we're going to be talking about equity design thinking, and it's a conversation that I think is fairly new to the sphere of program design, thinking about how do we do program design and development in a way that really centers community voices. This slide deck will be made available to you at the end of the event, and so that you'll be able to review it and have some tools to take away with you after we've done some learning together. So today's learning outcomes is to gain an understanding of how one's social location can influence design decisions. It's to better understand practices and considerations for inclusive design, and to develop tools for applying an equity lens to program design. So that's what we hope that you'll be able to take away from today's presentation. I have a quote that I want to start off with and maybe have you reflect a little bit. You'll see that through the process, we will model different ways that you can engage people in thinking or get feedback from community. And so just to kind of take note of the ways that we do that. John Carey, who is an architect, says, design has a unique ability to dignify. It can make people feel valued, respected, honored, and seen. And this is both the opportunity and responsibility of design. So the idea that we're really thinking about here is that no design of a program, of a building, of a policy, of a practice, of really anything is accidental. We all have the way that one designs a program in this case has the ability to include or exclude if we're not asking the right questions. And we'll talk about what some of those questions might be. When we're thinking about equity design thinking, we're thinking about all of us as designers. We design our world, we design our cultures, we design our workplaces, we design, in your case, you design how people play. And all of those things that you design are influenced by who you are. We don't have the time to get into a long conversation about equity and diversity and power and privilege, but it's really important at this point to kind of pause and consider who you are in relation to this conversation, who you are in relation to the work that you're doing in your organization, and thinking and considering about what we call the dimensions of diversity and how they may intersect and shift your relationship to power. What do we mean by dimensions of diversity? So often when we think about diversity and inclusion, we're thinking about these internal dimensions, the age, the gender, the sexual orientation, the physical ability, the ethnicity, the race, and how you might relate or not to what is stated to be the norm. So for me, I'm a Black, Latina, Muslim woman, I'm able-bodied, and so those are all parts of my identity. When we talk about diversity, often that's what we're talking about. So all of those things will include me or exclude me from particular spaces. I might experience more barriers or less barriers based on where I sit in that circle. But there's other places that I think is important for us to consider diversity, particularly when we think about program design. We want to consider what we call the external dimensions. So your income, your personal habits, your religious and spiritual identity, your educational background, your immigration status, your work experience. All of those things will also influence how you see and navigate this world and how the world sees and interacts with you. Okay. And then we want to think about the organizational dimension. So where and how do you sit within the organization that you're here representing today? What decisions do you make? Whose lives are you able to impact? What is the power that you might hold around that organizational table? Okay, so thinking about your work content, the division or department or group that you belong to, your level of seniority, your work location, whether you're unionized or you're ununionized, your management status. So all of those things will also influence how you access power and what kind of privilege do you have? So I really want us to think about that intersectionality. Often I think when we think about diversity, we're only talking about race. And I want us to move away from that a little bit, although it's very important to center and think about race. Think about how that identity might intersect with another part of your identity, right? And what might mean that you hold power or privilege. And what does that mean for some of the other places, the external dimensions and the organizational dimensions? So I want us to just pause for a moment and place yourself in the circle. If you think about your internal dimensions, so your identity, where do you stand? How do you relate to what we understand to be the normalized groups in society? So when I say about normalized groups, I'm thinking about white and Christian and middle-aged and able-bodied and heterosexual. So those type of things. What are the external dimensions? So where are you living? What is your income? What are your personal habits? What is your religious background? Your educational background? Your parental status? Those will all influence how you understand and navigate the world. And then in your workplace, what opportunities, what does power look like for you? Are you at the top? Do you make decisions? Can you make decisions? Can you influence decisions? Is there somebody above you? Where are you placed? Okay, so really consider that. Okay, so I want us to, as we consider that, think about this question. How does my relationship to power impact my work in community while designing with other people, etc.? Okay, so how does my relationship to power impact my work? Whether that's in community or while designing or while you're in a relationship with others. So I'll give you 2 minutes or 20 seconds to think about that question, and then I'll take anybody's thoughts. Okay, would anybody like to share? Using I statements, thinking about yourself.
Jeff, go right on ahead, please.
Sorry?
Jeff Carmichael raised their hand.
Okay, go ahead, Jeff. Thank you.
I didn't raise my hand.
Oh, I saw your hand in the camera.
Oh, in the camera. No, you know what I was doing? Just adjusting my camera. So.
Well, is there anything that you?
I'd much rather just listen to.
Okay, not a problem, Jeff.
Responses.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah.
Anybody else would like to share? Andrea, go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you for this. I think for me, I'm always thinking about what I can do to use the power and privilege I have to elevate and amplify the voices around me and the opportunities for those around me. And I'll use a programming example, 2 of them here in Victoria where I live. One is that we very intentionally have designed a girls, or those that identify as girls, program, and have tried to create a variety of different supports to ensure that those girls have a really positive experience and introduction to a variety of opportunities. And we've also worked to ensure that we have a girl or young woman identifying, leading that program and giving them the tools and support so that they're building their leadership capacity as we go through as well. So sort of a couple of tiers of sort of how we're intentionally building that.
Great, thank you, Andrea. And I see Rami's hand. Go ahead, Rami. You're on mute.
Hi, yeah. Great question. And when I think about my relationship to power, I think about kind of having a lack of power. Being in communities have traditionally been kind of left out of power discussions. So my idea of my relationship with power and how it impacts my work is more thinking in terms of working outside of systems that weren't necessarily built for folks who look like me. So working with community, working within mutual aid, and just really working outside of those systems and how to utilize what's available within my community to support each other.
Great, thank you, Rami. Okay, I can take one more thought if there's any. How does my relationship to power impact my work? Okay, I want us to really consider both of the pieces that Andrea and Rani shared with us. So thinking about how do you leverage the privileges and power that you do have to ensure that communities are represented and have the tools to be able to design and develop programming and contribute to programming themselves. And then Rani's point about being somebody who has historically lived and existed outside in the margins of community, how do you now take what you know and take it back to community to be able to access particular spaces that haven't historically been made for you? So I think it's part of kind of the two ways that we interact with power, and when we think about wanting to create programming that impacts marginalized communities. Okay, thank you for that, everybody. Okay, so when we talk about design, we want to think about how it works. There's 3 pillars to inclusive design or equity-based centered design, and there's Diana, that we want you to really kind of center as we think about this. So the first is to design for the margins. What does this mean? Really, when you're designing, always asking the question about who is not at the table, who is often excluded from this type of programming, who is often excluded from these types of spaces, and how do we really center those realities in our program design. So we're designing for the margins, you are designing for everybody is kind of what we think about as equity centered designers. Ensuring that the process and the tools themselves are inclusive. So are we using language? Are we using technology? Are we using ways of doing things in a way that folks will be able to engage and interact? Sometimes we develop the most brilliant program and then nobody shows up, nobody comes, nobody's attracted. And often that's about the tools and the processes that we're using that maybe weren't accessible themselves. And then constantly renewing your commitment to equity. It's not enough to start a program design and say, we want to include marginalized voices. We have to renew our intention throughout the process to ensure that at no point are we leaving some thinking behind. So really building in some checkpoints along the way to ask ourselves some of the critical questions that we'll share with you in a bit. So when we consider design, we think about how can we make sure that you're designing inclusive and equitable outcomes for all, no matter how big or how small the decision. Equity-centered community design is a unique creative problem-solving process based on equity, humility building, integrating history and healing practices, and addressing power dynamics and co-creating with community. So this is a diagram that kind of illustrates that. And our program designs always start with the hunch. Right? We always have some way or some reason we want to enter community. We don't believe that this group is being included. And so we want to develop a program that will bring those folks in, right? We want to ensure the inclusion of girls in sports. And so our program is meant to do that because we have a feeling about historically, the historical marginalization of those who identify as female. When we think about the hunch, we then want to do some investigation about what that means. And that includes understanding the history and the required healing that we might need in order to have a good program. Acknowledge and dismantle the power construct that exists. So really understanding what are the systemic barriers that have existed that have excluded particular communities from a program, institution, a space. And then we do all of these things to include community into the process. So what does this look like? So we start with the hunch, that's step 1. So that's identifying the potential points of intervention. Explore what you think you know about what the problem is. Often we have assumptions about what the problem is, and often those assumptions are based on what we call some deficit thinking. So it's really important to say, okay, we believe that there needs to be more representation of Black kids in hockey, for example, right? So what do we understand and what do we currently know about that statement? And then ask yourselves, how do you know it? Do we know it because there's been research done? Do we know it because there's anecdotal evidence? Do we know it because we saw something on TV? Do we know what do we know and how do we know it? Okay. The next thing is to validate that hunch. And that job takes up the biggest bulk of program design, really. Thinking about who do we need to talk to in order to really understand this issue deeply? In some cases, in programs, in equities, centered program design, they develop something called a persona. And the persona, to me, has some challenges with it, but essentially the idea is that after you've talked to community, after you've identified what we call subject matter experts, so people in community that identify as the target audience that you have, you are able to build a picture of the typical person that would be the beneficiary of your program, right? So if we're thinking about Black kids in hockey, then you're able to say, well, they live in this neighborhood, this is their socioeconomic status, these are their challenges, these are their pain points, this is their assets, really kind of understanding exactly who it is that you're talking about. And you understand that because you've done a lot of work and research to really understand where those folks are. From there, you ideate and you co-develop a new problem statement. So you co-develop a problem statement that is based on your hunch, but really helps you kind of pare down exactly what it is that you're targeting. And that question or that statement is based on all of the research that you've done from that main person. In doing that, you're able to work with community to identify possible solutions and innovate possible solutions, things that maybe you didn't even consider. In this case, we always say that even a bad idea is a good idea, because sometimes you put out an idea that seems so outlandish, but as you work with community, as you work with your subject matter experts, you're able to kind of pull things out. And then you do the thing. You put your solution to work, you get feedback about that solution in action, and then you course correct along the way. Throughout this process, you continue to listen and learn. And throughout this process, you continue to ask the critical questions. And those critical questions are as follows. What do I know about this issue? How do I know this about this issue? How has the status quo further marginalized communities? So how is it that what we've been doing so far, how has that marginalized communities? How do we know that it's marginalized communities? Are we sure that this is what the community wants? So maybe you have a brilliant idea, but that you've decided it around the boardroom table with program designers and folks who are employed in your organization. Have we ensured that that idea has actually gone back to community, that we've gotten the feedback, and that's actually what people need and what they want? And then ultimately, we're thinking always about who might be missing from this conversation. How do we develop a list of subject matter experts that will support the conversation? I saw that Diana entered the room, but I'm not sure if she's available to be on screen yet. But I'm just putting it up there. I know she's here.
Hi, I'm here. I just can't come in camera yet, but I'm here.
Okay, so we're going to try it. So we're going to start with the hunch. So we based it on a hunch that that we kind of developed out of conversation that we had with Mars when we first got in contact about doing this this presentation. And so it was about the exclusion or the perception that that Latinx youth were not were a group that were not involved in sports leadership programs, that there was an underrepresentation of Latinx youth. So our hunch was about visibility. So why are Latinx youth not represented in sports leadership programs? Okay, so that was the hunch. We know this, when I asked Mars, how do we know that this is true? They said to me, well, it's something that we've heard anecdotally. There's some research on this, and we know this, that this is happening in the community. Okay, so if this was a hunch that we were to work on, let's pretend that we are the group trying to tackle this problem. Okay, what we would be doing is validating that statement amongst ourselves first. Okay, how is it that we know? How is it that we know that Latinx youth are not represented in sports leadership program? What has brought us to that conclusion? What has brought us to wanting to have our intervention be around this issue? So what do we know? What do we know about Latinx, Latin American, Hispanic youth in sports, and how do we know it to be true? So I'm going to share a Jamboard with you. This is a tool that we often use. This is a tool that we often use with folks. It's an anonymous tool. And so how it works is, let me just make sure that anyone with the link can.
Yeah, I can jump in and while you.
Yeah, no, I just need you to, I just need you to change the access because you made it.
It should be on the, it should be on the link, like the latest link, it should be there.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that that's the one I clicked and the access is not available to everybody. It's viewer access. No, editor.
Okay.
So if you can just change it, and I'll explain it. So essentially what will happen is you will use a yellow sticky to let us know what you know about Latinx youth in your communities, okay? And you will use a green sticky to let us know how we know it. Okay, so if I were to put something in, I would say most Latinx youth come from families that have recently immigrated to Canada. Okay, and so how do I know this? I know this from personal experience, but I also know this because I've read some statistics from the Toronto District School Board, as an example, right? Or I could say that most Latinx young people come from poor families. How do I know this? Maybe it's an assumption that I have, or the Latinx youth in my community are often saying they can't attend programming because they have to work a job or two to support their families. Okay, so we're gonna work on this together, and let's see if I can share. Link.
I just passed it in the chat. See if people can access it now, because it is open on my.
Okay. Okay, yeah, everybody's in. Are people able to use the sticky notes on the side? There should be a sticky. Can somebody just confirm that they're able to make 2 edits?
Hi, I use Jamboard all the time, but I am not seeing the toolbar down the side
Yeah.
to be able to navigate anything. Sorry.
Nope, that's fine. Okay, maybe in the interest of time, we won't get into it, Diana, unless we can do a quick fix.
It shows in my bar, and it's linked to everyone. We can also type it in the chat. And so what we can do is the exercise invite us to really think about, answer the question of what we know about the community that we're trying to learn about, or the hunch that we have about that community. And so the first question is, what do we know about, whether are you familiar with Latinx communities, Latin community, Latin American, Hispanic? What do we know about them in sport?
So I'll stop share for a moment and we can put that question in the chat for folks. Yeah,
So if you don't mind, I'll help start it off.
Yeah.
So the Star, so the Star recently in May of 2022 put out an article that featured an Ecuadorian by the name of Ami Goya, and she spoke about how in Ecuador she was a social butterfly. She got along with all of her friends, and once she moved to Toronto, it was very difficult to make friends. She felt very isolated. And in this isolation, she was able to then connect with other peers who, and to then have discussions about how they all felt isolated. And so based on interviews and based on interviews and focus groups with 60 Hispanic people between the ages of 16 and 26, the study found that Hispanic students do not see themselves represented by teachers and peers, and many struggle with developing a sense of belonging in their school and community. And I think that this definitely translates to the question at hand.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we understand about Latinx youth is that they lack a sense of belonging in institutions, in Canadian institutions, and we know this because we saw it in an article that was sharing some research of Latinx youth. Okay, great. So it's based on some kind of factual statement. What else might we know about Latinx youth? What's important about this process, and sometimes it might feel uncomfortable because what you're actually doing is trying to expose what your own bias or assumptions are about a community that you have, which we all have biases and assumptions about communities that we have. And as you engage in an exercise like this, you start to kind of draw those things out. Oh, I have a perception that all of these types of young people experience extreme poverty. So somebody says they've refreshed it, now it works, that they experience extreme poverty. So we want to exactly know, like, how do we know this? Why do we know this? Can we back this up with some kind of data, some kind of fact? So people are now putting in I'm going to share my screen again so we can share, and we can go back to that link shared in the chat.
And oftentimes it's also okay to say, I know nothing about this community, therefore my point of intervention is limited.
Yeah. Okay, so somebody shares popular sports are baseball and soccer and football. So whoever wrote that, or if anybody else agrees with that statement, use a green sticky on the side to let us know how you know that information. There we go. So for those of you who are new to Jamboard, on the side, there's a sidebar. The little square is your sticky note. You can just type in and then change the color and press save, and it'll share it on the screen. So it's either a green for validating how you know information and a yellow for what the information is. I don't know what the population of this community is in our city. Okay, good. So that lets us know when we think about the subject matter experts and the extra information that we might need to do before we even engage in intervention planning, what we need to find out. So you could also, with a statement like that, I don't know what the population of this community is in our city, with a green sticky to validate that statement. How do you know that you don't know? Is that we don't have any existing research. It's not a community that we've tapped into historically. There's no representation in our current programs. So those are the type of things that you could put in. Anybody else have something? We'll move on just because we really just want to model and share with you some of the ways that we begin to think about it. So the first thing is to talk about your hunch and your assumptions about the communities that you want to target, and then you will do an exercise like this anonymously. Is good because it allows people to put up exactly where their spots might be and things that might be uncomfortable to share, and then you use a different color to validate how you know. In order to know, we need to reach out to local leaders and understand who is in our community. They're passionate about, so we know that they're passionate about family and loyal to them. How do we know this? And honestly, when we've engaged in an activity like this with a group that we're helping program design, sometimes there will be statements that they put up and they're like, I saw it on TV, or I know this because it's my perception of the community. Like there's nothing necessarily, it doesn't mean that the statement is incorrect, but there's nothing necessary that they've done to completely validate that statement. Dan, do you have something to add?
No, I think a lot of the information that we receive, it's important where you gather that information from. And oftentimes I had a friend who told me, who was Latin American and have this perception. So it is always important to validate where that information is coming from. And sometimes information from community is what we consider also very relevant and important because they have that lived experience that we often don't consider data.
Okay. I'm going to go back to the slides just in the interest of time. So we talked about our hunch and we talked about so thinking about what we want to intervene on, and then what we know about the community that we want to intervene on, and really kind of owning in on where some of the gaps might be or where some of the opportunities and strengths already might exist within your organization. Okay, from there, you're going to listen and learn. So the first thing that's required here is to create what we call a subject matter expert list, a SME list. We have here put together a Google form that will allow you to begin to compile your own SME list for any program that you're developing. But essentially, you are identifying community leaders, community champions, community members, people that you believe can help to support informing your program development. informing how you understand the community, and developing and building those relationships. We also encourage you to do some mapping of community organizations and community research. Sometimes information that you can find are from organizations that are out in your community, right? We wanted to learn, using the example that we started with about Latinx youth, is there, already community organizations that are banding together or are working around this issue that you don't have a connection with? And if so, how do you build that, that bridge? What are the ways that you can interact with them to learn more about this community?
And also, Gilary, I also think that the relevance and the importance of this list is that it becomes your database. So you can shift it, and you can create questions that are specifically to your programming. So notes that would allow you to know, oh, if I need to know something about the Muslim community, this is the person that I need to talk about because they have the lived experience. Or you can, and you can craft it in a way that allow you to have more deeper conversations about the problem or the hunch that you're trying to address.
I would also
someone asked if we can share the link. You can open the link.
So I will share this with you as well.
And this is just an example. So you can model it in any way you can, but what allows you to do is think about, have this always at hand when you're meeting with a stakeholder partner, or before you're meeting with them, or if you have a community consultation and you wanna gather those information, because oftentimes we do meet with a lot of people, but we forget to collect that data, and that actually becomes data that we can always use.
I would also say, try to find in your budgets ways to compensate people for time when you are doing this kind of research, whether that's even just providing meals for people, tokens, or bus transportation, anything that you can do to make it easier for people to be able to engage with your program design. They are now an extension of your team, helping you think about how to develop a program that will lend you that grant, that will get you those things. And so really thinking about, how do I ensure that this person it's not a one-sided relationship, that there is a bit of a transactional relationship involved there. And that is part of our equity design thinking process. How do I remove also barriers for their participation? If I'm working with the Latinx community, maybe the assumption is that most of them don't have a strong command of the English language. If that's the case, and it's important for you to engage with young people and their families who don't have a strong command of the English language, what things might you need to be putting in place in order to be able to connect with those folks? So really thinking about those things. And thinking about diversity, even within community, what we call community diversity. So there are Black Latinos, there are white Latinos, there are Latinos who don't speak Spanish, and those who do speak Spanish. There are first, second generation Latinos. There are still Latinos that have come to Canada as refugees. There are Latinos who have a higher socioeconomic background, lower socioeconomic background. So really thinking about the diversity within the individual community that you're trying to reach is really important, and developing a list of subject matter experts that reflect that intra-community diversity is important as well.
Gilary, if I intervene, a lot of people in the chat are commenting about the subject matter experts, and I think oftentimes when we think about this idea of who is an expert, we always think of, like, the person who's done the research, the person who's wrote about this, the person who have that academic experience. But with design thinking and equity design thinking, subject matter experts are those who have lived experience, those who have experience with the issue, or who represent a very specific community, or who have write about the issue, who have done research about the issue. So it is a combination of all, but most importantly is to remove this deficit approach that we have about who is an expert and who isn't. And so, sorry.
Your biggest, that's a great point. Your biggest asset for this subject matter expert list will be exactly the type of person that you are trying to target with your program. So who is the person that you would want to be joining the program that you are developing? Talk to them. What do they need? What's their life like? Why haven't they attended before? Why haven't you been able to reach them before? What have you been missing in order to build that connection? We did a project with a government agency on youth unemployment, where they led a process where they heard from youth and then developed some potential interventions and took those back to those exact youth and said, if we did this, would it work? Would your network be interested in something like this? If not, what else might need to happen? How can we tweak it, adjust it in a way that would serve your needs? Okay, so really thinking about subject matter expert in the broadest of sense, and it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody with a PhD or a high level position. While those folks can be really good in helping you understand the community itself is also a huge asset. Okay, and then you develop some potential questions to be posed to your subject matter experts for exploration or discussion. So it really is a very focused and guided conversation in trying to help you. And that earlier exercise that we did around your hunch and your assumptions about communities, the places where you identify that you don't know much or you want some more color and clarity on, that's where your subject matter experts will come in. Okay. All right, your next phase. So we've done our hunch. We've built our subject matter expert list. So our hunch is the type of intervention that we want to have, right? Our initial kind of thinking around a program that we want to develop. The second phase is to develop your subject matter expert and listen and learn about those who will become the beneficiaries of your program. Listen to what their needs are, what would they require of a program that you're trying to put together. And then you validate your new question. Okay, so we started with a statement that we'll share in a moment, but you are going to rethink about how you ask yourself as an organization that question in order to come up with identify a solution. Okay, once you've done that, you're going to innovate. No idea is too big, and bad ideas are also good ideas. Okay, so we started with the hunch, and the statement was, why are Latinx youth not represented in sports leadership programs? This feels like a really good statement to me, right? Like, Diana, why would we trouble this? What would be the reason why this is not a good way to begin thinking about program design? It has all the words. It has representation, it has leadership, it has youth. So what is the problem with this statement?
And I think we start thinking about why. We want to know why, right? Mm-hmm. We're focusing on the problem. We're looking from the problematic and deficit way of like, well, there isn't representation, and then we're coming with our assumptions. So we know that Latin American youth are no part of programming because there might not be many of them in Canada. And so therefore representing them, and these are assumptions that we have about a community that we might not know a lot about them, right? And so then we start questioning why is that we have these assumptions. But if we flip the question into think about, do we want to know why, or do we want to know how we can support them, right? And then we flip this statement, and we often start with how might we, because then we become part of the solution rather than focusing on what the problem is.
So does anybody have a thought or a suggestion on how we might change the why are Latinx youth not represented in sports program leadership question to a how might we? So the onus now is on us as the organization. How might we fill in the blank? Can somebody help us build a new question? You can put it in the chat, or you can say it out loud. Yeah, so should the question be framed as how can we increase engagement of the population? So how might we increase the engagement of Latinx youth in sports leadership? That's a good one. Anybody else?
How might we learn about the barriers? Sorry, I was just reading. How might we learn about the barriers to Latinx participation in our program? That's from Andrea.
Yeah. So now those are calling on us to do two different things. The one is asking about what do we need to put in place to increase engagement? And the other one is saying, what do we need to learn more about in terms of barriers? How might we increase representation of Latinx youth in sports leadership program? How might we encourage Latinx encourage or support Latinx youth to participate in sports leadership program, right? So you will work together as a team to create a question that really puts the onus on you as an organization and understands the systemic ways that exclusion has happened. So that we're not thinking about, oh, Latinx youth aren't coming because they just don't want to, because they don't have them prioritized, because this, that, the other. They're not coming because of things that the organization hasn't put into place that makes it a situation that that they're attracted to, or they can see value in. Okay. Okay, so we're gonna play a little bit. So if we take one of these questions, let's take the last question. I'll put it into the chat and I'll put it on a slide. I'll stop sharing for a moment. What we're gonna do is an activity that we often do. What's our time check like, Mars?
It's 11:50, right?
It is 11:50. I would like to give you at least, we're going to wrap up at 12:30. And so we'd like to leave, and from 12:15 to 12:30, we'd love for a Q&A and a wrap up. So you have until 12:15.
Okay, sounds good. So often when we are doing ideation or beginning to think about what might be some actual points of intervention, we do what we call a rapid fire exercise. And essentially it allows people very little time to think about what interventions could look like, just to kind of remove bias. I think that often we think way too much. We spend a lot of time thinking about what the actual action is and not enough time thinking about like doing the work to really understand the community. We often also will bias ourselves and pick apart an idea that might be a really good idea if it's approached in an appropriate way.
And also, Gilary, if I intervene, oftentimes we always come in thinking about a product. We also come in, especially when we have to design grant programs, and there's a grant application process that we need to produce something, right? So we always come in from the solution already in place, whereas design thinking really invite us to design a program to find a solution to a problem. And so those aspects in itself allowed us to think fast and think about different solutions and alternatives. And so when we say about bad ideas, we also think about those ideas that we never throw them away. They become part of our archive, and we can always come back to them.
Okay, so we're just going to model the rapid fire exercise. We're going to imagine that what we've done up until this point is that we've built our subject matter expert of Latinx youth and organizations that serve those youth, and research that has been done about Latinx youth in Canada and sports. So we have gained a really full and good understanding about our target audience for this program. Okay, we've redefined our question to a question that puts the onus on us organizationally, as opposed to the Latinx youth themselves, but us organizationally to remove barriers, because we've understood the barriers that exist for those communities. So we'll just imagine that we've done all of that work. Okay, now we're going to ideate. You can do this a number of different ways. You can include young people or your beneficiaries of your program in your ideation process. So invite them to a meeting of some sort that they help to brainstorm some ideas. Or you can, often how it does happen, unfortunately, that first part about including subject matter experts in ideation is my ideal, but in some cases that can't happen. So what you will do is bring your team together, ideate together, and then take those ideas back to the community for them to extend for you, trouble for you, offer new ways of thinking about what your interventions might look like. So how we do this is we'll do a rapid fire. Diana and I will give you how many seconds? Or what do you think? 30 seconds, 60 seconds? Diana?
30 seconds.
Okay, so we're gonna give you 30 seconds. I want you to think about this. How might we encourage support Latinx youth to participate in sports leadership? You are going to write down all of the ideas that come to your head. So get out a piece of paper and a pen. All of the ideas that come to mind that could address this question on a piece of paper. You're not gonna pick it apart. You're not going to say, but we can't do that because we don't have the funding. We can't do that because we tried it before and it didn't work. We can't. You're just going to put it down on paper. Okay. Once that 30 seconds happens, we will continue the activity. Okay, so let's start the timer. Okay. There's 30 seconds on the clock. All right, we're gonna start. Is there any questions before we begin? Okay, no problem, Jeff. Thank you. All right, let's go. 30 seconds. Think of a program. An action. Write it down. All right, that's your 30 seconds. Check off that arm. Alrighty, so what would happen now is then you will break up yourselves up into groups. So that's what we'll do. We will break you up. Stop sharing for a moment. We're gonna break you up into groups. How many are we? 16. Create 3 groups. Okay, we're gonna create 4 groups of 3 or 4. And you will choose your top 2 ideas. Okay, so we're going to give you about 2 minutes to do that. No, we'll give you 5 minutes to do that.
Yeah.
Okay, so share your ideas and come up with your top 2. All right, let's go.
I don't know why I'm not able to join.
Okay, let me see if I can move you your Gladys.
Okay, thank you.
Try that, Nicholas. I know that wasn't a whole lot of time, so I'm really sorry about that.
Not cuddle.
Quick, fast. You would typically spend more time in kind of coming up with what your best two ideas. Those two ideas, maybe we can hear some of those ideas here. You would come back as a group and share those ideas with everybody. No problem, Andrea. Once you do that, you would maybe pick your top 3 that you would go back to community, go back to your subject matter experts and say, which one of these rings best? Maybe they want to amalgamate them. Maybe they want to prioritize step 1, step 2, step 3. Perhaps they say like that one that you all thought was the greatest idea is the worst one and you should not even go there. So really kind of thinking about how do you take those things back. So maybe we can, at this point, if there are any ideas that folks were able to kind of come to a consensus on, we want to share here. And Hillary, go ahead, and then Rena.
I'll go ahead so there's no awkward silence. I came up with about 6 ideas, but the top 2 would be, if we're connecting like with youth, like would be to like get in the schools, go to where the people are, versus having the barriers of getting them to come to you.
Right.
And then based on, I think it was Mars that put in that stat about like how many of them were, what percentage were like immigrating to Canada, would be, you know, not necessarily like the barrier to participation is probably like, obviously it could be money, right? Because their priority isn't really necessarily to buy like sporting equipment. It would be, you know, the basic needs to live. So
right,
by providing that equipment, like to reduce that barrier, right?
Mm-hmm. Very good. And we might, like, that might be an assumption also that we have at the beginning of this process, that they're not participating because they don't have the money to buy equipment. How would I know this? I know this because I have a brother-in-law who played hockey as a kid, and the only way he was able to play hockey and go to the level that he was able to do, coming from a poor single mom household, was because all of the families that had money did things like pick him up from home, let him sleep over, bought equipment for him. Those are the things that made it possible. So I know that from a lived experience, right? And then you would perhaps continue to hear that from young people. It's not that I don't want to come, I just can't afford the equipment. And so that's where that program might be helpful. Thank you, Hillary. Okay, Renu.
Oh, I just was going to put in the chat that I actually was just going to highlight a great idea that Angelina came up with, and I was just going to offer for them if they wanted to share the idea, as well as Gladys came in near the end to share a great context. So just wanted to check in with them if they wanted to share with the group. Okay, Angelina or Gladys?
I don't know what you're thinking about, so go ahead, Rainy. You can share it.
Sorry?
Which idea was it?
Oh, sorry. It was a really great idea around the mixers.
Yeah, that idea is good.
Oh, yeah. So I had shared an idea, something around, you know, kind of like Latin mixers. I know that seniors, they tend to have like senior specific groups that meet often. And that's something that's dear to them and that they do regularly, and they do the culture specific things with each other. So if there is a way to, you know, kind of put that together for the Latinx community so they can feel where there's a safe space within their community for them as well. I think that opens the door to find out more information around some of those barriers, and then introduce some programming that allows them to feel welcomed into the sports, but starting with, you know, where's the safest place for them with each other, I guess.
Amazing, thank you. Anybody else have an idea?
Marlene, I think you had a couple.
Yes. So yeah, I talk about things, you know, incentivizing, and not necessarily to pay them to attend, but, you know, covering off things like bus fare, and I mentioned before providing uniforms or the cost of uniforms, and covering off program fees if there are any, because, you know, fees for sports are really quite expensive. Other things I thought of was, involving the parents and ensuring that there's that buy-in from parents and from families, and maybe doing information sessions to bring parents and young people out to hear more about what the program could be, and to hear from them what their needs and what their thoughts and ideas are. Linking the young people to sports leaders, and having, things like workshops and guest talks, maybe giving tickets to games. And, one that I didn't mention was potentially the language barrier, especially if they're newcomer young people, making sure that service is provided in Spanish or, whatever other language is important. And as well, if you're offering the program, if there's a community where there's a large population of Latinx young people, is maybe offering the program closer to where they live, taking the program to them, as opposed to having them come to you wherever you are.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Marie, for sharing. So I guess a recap of that activity for if you'd like to use it. So in your team, you would give everybody 30 seconds, no more than a minute really, to come up with all of the wild ideas that they have to intervene on the issue that you've identified. After you've done all of the research to validate your assumption about a community need, okay? They get 1 minute, they write it all down. They choose their top 2. They get broken up into smaller groups. That group shares amongst each other and they choose their top 2. That comes back to the main group. Everybody shares their top 2. So if we had 4 groups, now you have 8 ideas that you continue to pare down until you have 3 good ideas that you feel confident about. Those are the ideas that go back to community so that they can then be ultimately the ones to select which intervention you're going to use, or to help at least inform what intervention you're going to do. This process takes time, which I know is challenging for the not-for-profit sector, is challenging for the service sector. Time is not something that we have, but really in order for you to have programming that community feels is impactful, you need to take the time from the beginning for them to feel like that they have buy-in, that they've had a say, and that really they have shaped how you're using the resources that you have and how you're leveraging that kind of privilege.
And just to add, when you're designing this process in the deck, there's a list of critical questions. So always have your bank of questions that when you are exploring these ideas, you go back to those questions and you ask, because oftentimes we come up with a great idea, but then we go back to the question. And then when we question it back, then we realize it is not as critical as we thought. So that's why you go back to both your bank of questions and your bank of ideas, and then they become part of your archive folder. So every time you start a project, you always have that archive, because there are ideas that you might not consider before because situation changes.
Mm-hmm. At this point, Mars, we're happy to take any questions as we wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for your participation.
And apologies for coming in video late in the session.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending, for staying to the very end. I know that an hour of conversation and unpacking and learning is awesome time to take out of your professional, out of your workday to focus on professional development. I want to just really thank Gilary and Diana for coming through and really blessing us with knowledge and thinking deeper about how we approach program design and other ways to consider how we can either use the tools that we currently have or add tools and things like Jamboard, and just really broadening the visual aspect of how we collate this data. So moving forward, and this is the Q&A section. Just before I begin, I just want to share with you a bit about Diana, or Diana, because I like to say
Diana.
Diana. I just want to share a little bit about Diana's work. So Diana Grimaldos is a strategist, a community organizer, and a human rights advocate working at the intersection of community engagement, philanthropy, and research. She works as a manager of community engagement and research as a national philanthropic organization that supports equitable access to post-secondary education for lower income families in Canada. Diana has over 20 years of experience in the nonprofit sector in community engagement, government relations, multi-sectoral partnership development, and the implementation of collaborative programs with equity design and evaluation. Diana holds a BA in psychology and a master's in leadership and community engagement from York University, and a program evaluation certificate from Laurier. So I just had to give you a little bit of background, let you know that I wasn't just saying she was brilliant, she came with receipts, okay? If you guys have any questions or commentary you want to share or thoughts, I would love to hear it. I'll just add that when reaching out to different equity groups, I feel like it's important to just go and spend time in the community before we start asking for information or extra things that would honestly benefit us as in the nonprofit sector. So that was just my little from our conversation earlier. So who's got the questions and who's got the commentary?
Ranu has a great question. How might we pursue funders to give us time to build programming with a from the ground up versus lifting up into the present box? That's $1 million question.
Yep. So as a funder, as a person who is able to champion the community action grant, what I tell folks when they come to our support sessions is use your logic model. And if you don't know what that is, I am more than happy to help you walk through that, because you have that regardless if you are a first-time program, like a pilot program, or if you've been running for a long time. We can now assess what your inputs are and how that would actually persuade the readers for us, the selection circle, to select your organization. Do you know how to make a realistic budget? Are there any gaps in the conversation about what you are using for your inputs, admin, and then do your activities and objectives make sense together? And will you be able to reach those short to long-term outcomes? How have you engaged the community that you're intending to serve? Are there other organizations doing that work currently? And have you coordinated or collaborated with those organizations previously, and now you're filling a gap that they weren't able to reach? So it's one, my biggest thing is come to a support session and ask the questions that you want to know. And if you come in the group support session, you may hear questions you hadn't considered previously, and now you can also add that information into the way that you answer the expression of interest or the full application, depending on what round of funding, what round of the funding cycle you are in. That's what I would say for the foundation side.
Sometimes you might be able to apply for grant money in two parts. So you apply for money for a community research project, which would allow you to do that investigation about community. And then you use those results to inform your application for the program that has come up. So you're not using the program funding to do that research piece. You're using a community-based research funding project to be able to build into a program.
The other thing that is important to consider as well is that if your organization don't already have, develop a theory of change, because the theory of change will really inform your thinking, not only as an issue, but also as an organization. So what problem are you trying to solve? And if you do this, what will be the main outcome? So oftentimes, I work in a foundation as well. So oftentimes when we have applications that come with an already developed theory of change, it really gives you the bigger picture of knowing where the organization is heading and where are the main goals and outcomes for that specific program. So this really help you really frame the bigger problem. And as Gilary said, there are organizations that fund specifically community-based research. So you have two tools in your box of saying, well, we know this problem, we're working towards here, but we still have more to get us to our main outcome of our theory of change, right? Improve outcomes to youth. If we do this, then we have more representation of X, Y, X, right? And that will be.
Yeah, I love it, Diana. And I would also offer writing a grant to get a grant might be a challenge as well. So I would also say there are organizations that do research to practice, like SIRC. Then you have we just actually today changed the game, just launched a research event, just launched the event for the research they have done. You can look to overall sport, like boards of like for Canada sports in the sport for development sector. It's sport for development research is a huge thing, from anything from employment to equity groups. DEI is huge right now, so there's a lot of folks doing that work. And then you can always email me and ask me directly, and then I can either buck Gilary and Diana for some advice, or I can give you what we have for MLSE Launchpad, whether it's scoreboard or any of the other initiatives or research that has been done in-house. I'm more than happy to support in that way as well.
One last thing I'll add, and it's just, and I'm biased in this, is just because I think academic partnerships are also important. And so think about who is in the sector, who is doing academic research, or who is working in both in the intersection of community and research. And I know Marlene is doing some of that work. So it's always important to bring those worlds together, because oftentimes we see them separate. But if you combine as scholars and if you combine communities, also we are able to build knowledge. And so oftentimes we forget about that. And that's how we challenge the system into, there are people, because a lot of time community organizations are on the ground doing the work, but they're not documenting what they're doing. And so forgetting that piece is important in bringing it back into the work of the organization, writing reports, creating, documenting programming that you have done, and demonstrating the change that has happened in your community.
Perfection, absolute perfection. I love that. Anyone else have any questions? We have a few minutes left, and would love to help, especially when it comes to funding and program design. I think there's so many different areas and levels to this game that, whatever we can offer, super happy to offer. And again, you can email us to ask questions later. If you guys don't mind, I didn't mean to speak for you.
No. So we've linked our email addresses and our Twitters on the slide deck that we shared, so you'll be able to access us.
And if y'all know Brian Heal or Marika Warner, or any folks out of Launchpad, feel free to stop by and talk to them in person. They're super helpful and friendly, and always willing to have a conversation. If you would like a little more of a sit down energy. Some people are nervous about Zoom combos, so there are many options to get the answers you're looking for sure. Well, if that's all, do you guys have any events or anything you want to publicize that folks can attend in the future?
No, but Diana and I are, we're in two different countries right now, but we are thinking deeply about what it would look like to convene people potentially here in the topics to think about how to do design thinking from an equity lens and bring some leaders together. So you're the first to hear about this.
We're developing a summit.
We're developing it. We're trying to see how we do it, because we think that there's a need for some camaraderie around this issue, and a lot of us are doing program design in this way without necessarily having the language to say, oh, it's equity design thinking. You're doing the work already of engaging your beneficiaries, your target groups in development and creation of the work. And so perhaps helping folks develop the language, develop some tools, develop some ways to do it remote, in person would be really helpful, and to do it in a sunny place would be great.
All right.
So stay tuned.
Yes, we will stay tuned. Channels on. Thank you so much again, Gilary and Diana. Thank you to all of you guys for coming and joining us today. You are super appreciated. Reclaim the last 10 minutes of your time. Go get some water, some coffee, some lunch, because the stomach is grumbling. And again, I really appreciate you all today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.